Welcome everyone, Moadim L'Simcha. I hope that your Chag is one of celebration, goodwill, and of aspiration. We're returning to our subject. We ended last week with a text by Jonathan Sacks, who laid out for us a framework for understanding this Zionist dream. He indicated that there were two stages in the pursuit of the Zionist dream. One was to create a state, and that one, he said, was achieved. And the second one was to create a model society, and that's what we need to work on. So basically, he said that we prepared the stage. That's his outlook. It was his outlook. We prepared the stage now for the intense work of working inwardly to create the ideal society that reflects the values of our tradition as they can be lived in a real way in a Jewish state. Now, of course, I have a number of things to say about that. One, when I was young, we would discuss all these issues about religion and state, and one of the responses to the whole question of how religion and state interacted was, well, first we have to establish Israel's security, and then we can get to that issue. That issue was always something that we put aside. That issue was something that we weren't ready to discuss yet. First, we had to be secure, then we could deal with that issue. I think we realize that's a big mistake. If there's a problem, a pressing issue, don't ignore it. It's true in general in life, in relationships. You don't ignore an issue and say, "Oh, we'll get to it later," if it's something that's really eating away. And it's true in the history of nations and developing one's sense of who one is. Ignoring central issues only allows it to fester, and by the time you get to it, it may be too late. So we're contending with the whole issue of the interaction of religion and state. It's something that should have been dealt with in the moments of the founding of the state, or maybe even earlier, worked out, and it never was. It never was. And of course, we also know that there is no constitution in Israel. That's my first reflection. Number two, the general question about Zionism. I think I mentioned this last time, and I saw a piece in the forward the other day by Jonah Platt. This Passover, let's retire the word Zionist once and for all. So I thought he was maybe listening into our conversation, and what he wrote was, I think I'm right. Jonah Platt is the young man who's a star on Broadway, if I'm not mistaken, and now has a podcast. With this outside impact in mind, I present the following idea for consideration. This Passover, it's time to retire the word Zionist. I understand that the word is a great source of pride and a core identity for many, but I also believe the term is dead weight, dragging us down and holding us back. He says that only a third of Americans are familiar with the word Zionism. He writes, as anyone who uses social media can attest, Zionist has been seemingly weaponized and transformed into a derogatory term for Jew. Using Zionist as a code word allows anti-Jewish bigots to demonize Jews without having to actually say Jew. It's actually true. And then he gets to this conclusion: we no longer need a term to describe someone who believes a state of Israel should exist as a Jewish homeland, because a state of Israel as the Jewish homeland already exists, and it is not going anywhere. Not existing is simply not an option. Let's stop defining ourselves by a term that implies it is. All right, I disagree, obviously. I thought I would mention it only because I think that there's a lot of current discussion, and not just current, it's been going on for years, including among Jewish leaders. Should we hold on to this term? And I believe unfailingly and with great commitment, we need the term Zionism, because Zionism sort of casts it's an aspirational concept, meaning we have not yet fulfilled what Zionism is all about. It's not just about a structure, it's about the way we're going to live in that structure, in that state. And as such, we need to have that as a type of judgment about how we're doing. We'll continue to talk about this, and maybe there will be some discussion and some questions that you have. But I'm not willing to give up on the term. I think it's essential in terms of laying out for us what we still need to fulfill, A. B, I don't want to concede to the people who are detractors. It seems to me that when you're saying Zionism is dead weight or carries with it a burden, what we're saying is it's too much for us to fight against those who are the critics of Zionism. So let's just throw the term away, which is just about as much as saying as, well, their arguments are too strong, and why should we have to face those arguments? We must face those arguments. And we have to understand why we hold on to the term Zionism. Enough said, maybe you'll have some questions to deal with it. Now, on the issue of religion and state, one final word before we begin, we go back to the text, and that is there was a famous conversation between Yeshayahu Leibovitz and Ben-Gurion that went something like this. Leibovitz, we'll hear from him, maybe we'll have some quotes from him as we move on, was a scientist, a philosopher, a brilliant scientist, a brilliant philosopher, and a gadfly. He, in June of 1967, the day after the Six-Day War, Leibovitz was the first one who said we should give it all back because we don't know what to do with it. We have no plan. It's going to be a burden, and it's going to drag us down. It's going to drag us down militarily, and it's going to drag us down morally. So it's time. What we don't need those territories. He said many other things. Some of them were a little bit. He pushed the edge, but he reported this conversation with Ben-Gurion. Said, Ben-Gurion, tell me something. You're a secular Jew, and you're a secular politician representing the Labor Party. Why is it that you support a chief rabbinate in the state of Israel? That seems to be contrary to your own principles, right? I see here that Anita agrees. So Ben-Gurion responded, yeah, you're right. You're right. However, what I want to make sure that religion is under my thumb and not an independent force. So Ben-Gurion understood that religion living principally, right, in principle, is a force that counters the political interests, that is a check, that can be a check on the political self-interest usually expressed and pursued by nations. Religion is necessary as a critique. So Ben-Gurion said to Leibovitz, I want religion under my thumb. And Leibovitz said to Ben-Gurion, you're scared to have religion be an independent force that can counter, and we're paying for it. So what we're trying to do now is to recover that religious spirit that hasn't been corrupted by the political system that controlled it, and by a religion that actually pursued the power that they gained by being in cahoots with the government itself. So is it possible to redeem religion? I hope so. I still hope so, because to me, that's a saving dimension in terms of our sustaining our involvement with Israel and our commitment to Zionism. All right, to continue with our sources and our study today. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly in reviewing some of the material. Just give me a second here. I'm going to share my screen. We are. And here we are. Wait, no, that's not it. This is it. Okay. All right. So remember, I talked about the values that we need to pursue in a return to Zionism. So one of the values is what I call a cultural renewal. And the best example that I could find is actually Ruth Calderon's speech to the Knesset. Who's Ruth Calderon? Ruth Calderon is an Israeli woman who completed a PhD in Talmud. I think she was one of the first to do so, if not the first, at the Hebrew University. And she created a secular institute in Tel Aviv called Alma, that I think now is part of the Hartman Institute. And Ruth was my chavruta at the Hartman Institute many years ago. She joined in with Yair Lapid's party and had a position in the Knesset. And in her maiden speech, you know that every member of Knesset, I assume this is true in other parliaments as well, who's newly elected, presents their first speech. This is what she did. She came to the podium with a volume of Talmud. It was her grandfather's Talmud. Now, remember, or maybe you don't know if you didn't see this, the person who was chairing the session of the parliament, of the Knesset that day, was a member of the, I'm forgetting the name of the party. What's the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party? Shas. He was a representative of Shas, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, chairing chairing the session, and Ruth Calderon gets up to the podium with a volume of Talmud. This never happened before. And she says the following: I am convinced that studying the great works of Hebrew and Jewish culture are crucial to construct a new Hebrew culture for Israel. It is impossible to stride toward the future without knowing where we came from and who we are, without knowing intimately and in every particular the sublime as well as the outrageous and the ridiculous. The Torah is not the property of one movement or another. The Torah is not the property of one movement or another. I would say that CSP understands this very well. David Hartman used to say to us the following, that the liberal Jews have ceded the Torah to the Orthodox. Part of our reclaiming of Judaism for the state of Israel also involves reclaiming Judaism for the Jewish people, because the Jewish people have given up on Torah. They've said, the Orthodox Jews, they open the text. My great fear, by the way, is that most liberal Jews have never cracked the binding of a Jewish book. They've never read a Rashi in its text itself. We have to make sure that is not the fate of our texts and of our learning. We have to recover and champion that learning. She says, it is a gift that every one of us received. We were all there to receive the Torah, and we have all been granted the opportunity to meditate upon it as we create the realities of our lives. Nobody took the Talmud or rabbinic literature from us. We gave it away with our hands. When it seemed that another task was more important and urgent, building a state, raising an army, developing agriculture and industry, etc. The time has come. I mean, this reverts back to the point I raised, that we postpone. We'll get to it. The time has come to reappropriate what is ours, to delight in the cultural riches that wait for us, for our eyes, our imaginations, our creativity. I aspire to bring about a situation in which Torah study is the heritage of all Israel, in which the Torah is accessible to all who wish to study it, in which all young citizens of Israel take part in Torah study as well as military and civil service. Together we will build this home and avoid disappointment. The person chairing the session of the Knesset, the member of the ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi party, challenged Ruth while she was reading the Talmudic passage, and they had a whole Talmudic argument in front of the Knesset. It was fabulous, because if you could imagine, this is a rabbi chairing the session of the Knesset who never spoke to a woman about any serious religious issue in this way, and he was compelled to do so by Ruth's presence, and everybody witnessed it, everybody smiled, everybody understood that there was something transformational about her presentation. What she's saying is, the state of Israel provides us with an opportunity to spread the study of Torah in ways in which it never was experienced before in Jewish history. I was once in Madrid on a Shabbat, and after services at a Kiddush, there was a young man that was standing next to me. He looked kind of interesting. I said, where are you from? He said, Brooklyn. I said, where in Brooklyn? He said, Williamsburg. I said, oh, that's the place of Satmar Hasidim. He said, well, I'm a Satmar Hasid. I said, what are you doing here in Madrid? He said, I'm on vacation. I said, Satmar Hasidim go on vacation? He said, yes. I then said to him, what do you do? He said, he's a chemical engineer. I said, Satmar Hasidim are chemical engineers? He said, well, some of us, the Rebbe told us to go and pursue work. By the way, Hasidim work in the States, at least. It's the yeshiva students, the Lithuanian yeshiva students, who are sitting and learning. The Hasidim, pretty universally work. And many of you know that 47th Street, you're familiar with the Diamond District and other areas. electronics, many Hasidim in that business. We continued the conversation, and I said to him, you know, the one thing that disturbs me is that your Rebbe was anti-Zionist and anti the state of Israel. So he said to me, don't misunderstand. He was opposed to the Zionist government. However, he never encouraged our prayer or our appealing against the state of Israel, and he actually separated himself from the extremists whom you see demonstrating. Then he turned to me and he said, tell me one good thing that the state of Israel has contributed religiously. And without missing a beat, I said to him, in the state of Israel today, there are more people studying Torah than ever before in Jewish history. There are secular yeshivot. I mean, I didn't say this to him, right? There are, right? Ruth Calderon is an example. So there's a place called Bina. There's a yeshiva attached to the conservative movement. There is, as I said, Alma before, and many other efforts to generate the wide and broaden the immersion of Israeli Jews in the study of their texts. So that's one of the gifts, it seems to me, one of the gifts of Zionism, and it's one that's celebrated by Ruth Calderon. So that's one value. Next, in general, when we talk about values, we think about ethics and morality. And here the champion was Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am, you know, his name was Asher Ginsburg. He was born in the 19th century in a Hasidic home. Over the years, he left his Hasidic background and he became a man of letters, an essayist, Hebrew stylist. He lived in Odessa for many years within a group of Jewish intellectuals. Bialik was there. Then he went to London, where he worked for Vysotsky Tea. He was a clerk, and eventually he retired to Palestine, to Tel Aviv. I think I mentioned the other day, I don't know if I did, that every day Achad Ha'am lived on what became Rehov Achad Ha'am in Tel Aviv, and every day between 2 and 3 the street was closed because that was the hour during which Achad Ha'am took his nap. So he was central to the cultural definition of the upcoming Jewish state, and he was also critical to the development of Zionist theory, cultural Zionism. Listen to what Achad Ha'am has to say. He visits Palestine in 1891, and he writes Truth from the Land of Israel. This is something that everybody should have read. But not this alone. In all things, it is our custom to learn nothing from the past for the future. There is certainly one thing we could have learned from our past and present history, how careful we must be not to arouse the anger of other people against ourselves by reprehensible conduct. How much more then should we be careful in our conduct toward a foreign people among whom we live once again? Who are these? The Arabs. To walk together in love and respect, and needless to say in justice and righteousness. And what do our brethren in Eretz Israel do? This is 1891. Quite the opposite. They were slaves in their land of exile, and they suddenly find themselves with unlimited freedom, the kind of wild freedom to be found only in a country like Turkey. This sudden change has engendered in them an impulse to despotism, as always happens when a slave becomes king. And behold, they walk with the Arabs in hostility and cruelty, and unjustly encroaching on them, shamefully beating them for no good reason, and even bragging about what they do. And there is no one to stand in the breach and call a halt to this dangerous and despicable impulse. To be sure, our people are correct in saying that the Arab respects only those who demonstrate strength and courage, but this is relevant only when he feels that his rival is acting justly. It is not the case if there is reason to think his rival's actions are oppressive and unjust. Then, even if he restrains himself and remains silent forever, the Arab, the rage will remain in his heart, and he is unrivaled in, quote, taking vengeance and bearing a grudge. Prophetic words by Achad Ha'am, but he makes use of a phrase from the book of Proverbs, which is really very important. And I urge you to look back to find the verse. I think it's chapter 30. I'm not sure of the verse, but it's in chapter 30 of Proverbs. It's for 3 things you will pay, and for 4, etc. And the first thing that's listed among the things that need to be rejected is when a slave becomes a king. What the author of Proverbs is saying wisely is, be careful. In the course of history, when slaves were redeemed, what what they dreamt of and what they attempted to achieve was vengeance. They pursued vengeance against those who had oppressed them. Be careful. We've had a history of seeing ourselves and being considered slaves. Suddenly, when we are redeemed and freed and when we have power, when we were powerless, we couldn't do anything. Now that we have power, we're going to exact vengeance from those who oppressed us and from those who are currently oppressing us. Where those who are abused, nations that have been abused become abusers. When you're attacked, then you have to attack back. There's no such thing as maybe pursuing some sort of reconciliation. The pride of the nation requires that we must fight back to defend ourselves. Otherwise, we'll look weak. Yehuda Amital tells us, yeah, you're going to look weak, but they're going to remember that you beat them for no reason. And and be careful. Be careful in your behavior. In fact, my teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, writes that in chapter 12 in Exodus, where it says that during the Passover, the night when the angel of death, when the Malach HaMavet is passing over the homes, the verse especially stresses, Al tetzu ish mi petach beito. Do not leave your house. The question that we ask is, why shouldn't you leave your house? Your house has already been daubed with the blood. God knows, God certainly knows, or the angel knows who's Jewish or who's Israelite and who's Egyptian. What's the problem? Why can't they leave their homes? They can't leave their homes because they cannot be witnesses to the violence. Because when they're witnesses to the violence, they could become inured to the violence and eventually embrace the violence, like all slaves have done in the slave rebellions throughout history, whether in England in the, I think, the 13th century or 14th, there was a slave revolt, whether in Germany, the slave revolts in Rome in the past, all those slave revolts were with violence. God wanted to prevent a slave revolt of violence and said, stay in your homes and don't let the violence rub off on you. Don't allow it to touch you because it will corrupt you if you become witnesses to the violence. Yehuda said, we've been corrupted by our power already in 1891. And he continues to write in 1922, there's a rumor that a Jew has killed 2 innocent Arabs. And Yehuda writes a letter to Aretz. Jews and blood, are there any greater opposites? This is how I concluded one of my first articles written years ago. And I was certain then that this was an innate idea whose truth no Jew would ever doubt. Indeed, what have we managed to salvage from the Churban's destruction, meaning the Shoah, I'm sorry, before the Shoah, from the destruction of the temple, if not the teaching of our prophets, which we took with us on the long road of exile to illumine for us our darkened lives in foreign lands. Our blood has been spilled like water in all 4 corners of the earth over the course of thousands of years, but we have not spilled blood. We always remembered that the great moral truth which our ancestors have bequeathed us is the Torah of the future that we must guard and for which we must be prepared to give our lives until it becomes the possession of all humanity and the animal within us ceases to rule the lives of individuals and society. In other words, it's the Torah, it's the ethics of Torah that control our impulses and humanize us in such a way that we become sensitive to the spilling of blood, and we understand the human spilling of blood is the worst violation in which a human can engage. In this way, our people live generation after generation in foreign lands among nations that live by the sword and for whom bloodshed was their daily activity. But we, the people who were pursued in every place with all of our external humiliation, looked with disgust at our neighbors whose hands were smeared with blood. And within the depths of our heart, we knew that we don't now, nor will we ever have a relationship to the savage existence, because in our hand we guarded the great moral truth that in the future was to spread in all lands and bring about an end to the brutality, cruelty, and bloodshed in all the world. Yehuda is stating that the purpose of being Jewish, the goal of being Jewish, our aspiration, worldly, a universal aspiration, is that we should be able to transmit and model. We should be able to model for humanity how to live in peace, how to eradicate the impulse to shed blood, how to eradicate the impulse to use power in a way in which we dominate other people. Then we will sit securely in our land and see with our own eyes the great victory, the victory of our moral Torah, for whose sake we were murdered over the course of thousands of years. Now, I want you to hear this. This is a man who's rejected orthodoxy. rumor about Achad Ha'am, or the stories are that on Shabbos afternoon, he and his buddies would sit around the table studying the Rambam, Maimonides, and smoking cigars and cigarettes. So, in other words, they were a first generation who had torn the yoke of the burden of observance, right? Torn off that, released themselves in that way, but they were still engaged. And they understood that there's this great source of wisdom, the values that inhere our tradition. Achad Ha'am says, as we pursue our national goal, we need to nurture that center of that gives meaning to our existence as Jews, and that's our morality. That needs to be strengthened. In fact, Achad Ha'am has a great argument with Herzl and the Zionist establishment. He feels this needs to be the first level of achievement, of pursuit, meaning before we go politically to build the state, we have to rebuild Judaism and Jewish values, because modernity has cast a pall on the Judaism of the tradition. We have to redeem the tradition, the values of the tradition that can be transmitted to a population that's no longer abiding by and no longer feels obligated by the orthodoxy of the halachic Judaism in which they were raised. What type of Judaism will be carried on? That needs to be our primary goal and our focus. And now, he says, our generation has merited to see a semblance of the dawning of our redemption, the return of our children to our land. Indeed, is the end, when we will be a light unto the nations, imminent? Now, he says, what are we able to say? If the aforementioned rumor is true, aha, God, is this indeed the end? Is this indeed the objective that our ancestors aspired to attain and for whose sake suffered all of those indignities? Is this indeed the dream of the return to Zion, spilling blood of innocent Arabs that our people dreamed for thousands of years? That we will come to Zion and defile the land by shedding innocent blood? Okay, so Achad Ha'am challenges us, the challenge. Can we adopt the values of the Jewish tradition and live with them in a national environment? Right? Ruth Calderon challenges us. We need to be learned. We need to reclaim the sources of our tradition. We need to be able to learn what those values are by our acquaintance with those sources, right? And Achad Ha'am says it's those sources that will shape the values that we can bring forward into the framework of a political enterprise. However, this religious goal is complicated by messianism, meaning the association of the rebuilding of the state of Israel with the idea that the state of Israel is the first dawning of our redemption, the flowering of our redemption, the beginning of a messianic state. The danger, of course, is, as you'll see, that the messianism introduces the divine into the political and grants the political a type of absoluteness that is oppressive, persecutorial, and actually violates the very values that we're trying to promote. You'll see that as we study the sources. And the great source of religious messianic Zionism is the teaching of Rabbi Kook. Rabbi Kook was the first chief rabbi of Palestine. He was appointed by the British in 1920. He had been in Yafo. He had come from Lithuania, where he was a student in the same yeshiva as Bialik, as Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great poet, the yeshiva of Volozhin, which was established by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin right outside Vilna. Rabbi Chaim was a student of the Gaon of Vilna, right? So that's the pedigree, all right, of these great sages. And Rabbi Kook developed his own sort of messianic vision. He was a poet, he was a mystic, he was a halachic authority, he was a political leader of the Yishuv, of the Jewish settlement in Palestine in the early part of the 20th century. And he was larger than life, and someone who was respected across the spectrum. In secular kibbutzim, where he visited the secular kibbutzim and he valued them. He said, these secular Jews are doing holy work in building the land. And he was, of course, valued within the religious community and even in the ultra-Orthodox community that resented him for his Zionism. More to be said, but not not now. So Rabbi Kook writes the following. I'm going to read only parts of the writing. We have to move through. We don't have, as usual, we don't have a lot of time. Then Rabbi Kook writes as follows: Master of wars. This is after the First World War, which the rabbis themselves recognize the evils, how all the nationalist struggles really laid the groundwork for the war and understood the dangers of nationalism. Nevertheless, Kook writes, Master of wars, sower of righteousness, producer of salvations, creator of cures, awesome of praises, master of wonders, who renews with his goodness daily the act of creation, let's shine a new light on Zion, and let us all merit quickly in his light. He's writing this according to the extent of the war in quantity and quality, so increases the expectation of the feet of Messiah through it. So he says, God, this war has opened up an opportunity. We realize that we're on the verge of a messianic, of a new dawn, right? After this war. And there are new possibilities in the world. And your presence will unfold in this world as we settle the land. The present world war is possessed of an awesome, great, and deep expectation attached to the changes of time and the visible sign of the end in the settlement of the land of Israel. With great intellect, powerful courage, and piercing logic, with true longing and clear thought, we must receive the lofty content of the light of God that is revealed wondrously in the events of these wars especially. It's a very troubling passage to me, very troubling. It's a way in which Rabbi Kook tried to find something positive of the nature of something that was catastrophic. And even though, I mean, I have to say, I can't imagine that he thought that warfare was something positive, that the killing, that there was, after all that was involved. Nevertheless, theologically, he tries to uplift some value associated. And he goes on to say the following in this paragraph, I'll summarize for you, that as Jews, we made a deal with history. The deal with history was, we will absent ourselves from history. We're going to grant history to them. If I can use the term, excuse me for using it, we're going to give history to the Goyim. Excuse me. That is, they're the ones who are going to act politically. They're the ones who are going to pursue power. They're the ones who are going to shed blood. We're going to stay in the background, and we're going to devote ourselves to developing our character, to preserving the values that need to be transmitted worldwide. While the world is fighting, we'll sit and study. And we'll then prepare ourselves for being able to reflect those values and model them for the world when the right time comes. We're waiting for that time. And Rabbi Kook says, Jacob sent to Esau the royal purple, meaning that's a quote, that's a Talmudic quote. And what it is that Jacob told Esau, the deal is, you take the royal purple, meaning you take politics. I'll take the spirit, right? And you run the world until the time comes. Let my master pass before his servant. It is not worthwhile for Jacob to engage in statecraft when it must be full of blood, when it requires an ability for wickedness. We receive, this is so interesting relative to the prior quote about the war, sort of unleashing this messianic possibility. We received but the foundation, enough to found a people. But once the trunk was established, we were deposed. Right, as we had an early history, we established ourselves as a people, and then we went underground. Right, the temples were destroyed, we lost our sovereignty, we were deposed, strewn among the nations, planted in the depths of the earth, until the time of the song arrives, and the voice of the turtle dove will be heard in our land, quoting the Song of Songs. And what he's intimating is until the times of the Messiah, meaning until throughout history. Throughout human history, there will be battles. Throughout human history, nations will pursue power. We will be the powerless who will be subdued. We will be developing an outlook, a hashkafa, a worldview that embraces a spirit that is antagonistic to the militarism of world history. And the only when the time arrives, when the Messiah arrives, we assert our political power. And when we assert our political power, there won't be any warfare any longer, or whatever. Warfare will become moral. I don't know. I don't know what Rabbi Kook would have said. But what I do know is what his son said. And if we can't necessarily blame Rabbi Kook for the nature of Jewish messianism, that is, Rabbi Kook the father, for the way in which Jewish messianism has been expressed, we certainly can tag his son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, who in 1967, in May of 1967, presented a speech just 3 weeks before the war. And in that speech, which is called now Psalm 19 to Zion, he said as follows. He said, "Where is my Hebron? Where is my Shechem? Where is my Nablus? Where is my Jerusalem?" He said, in May 1948, he said to his students, May 1948, May 14th, Hey Iyar, the 5th of Iyar, when the people in Israel were dancing in the streets, I stayed at home. How could I dance? There was no Jerusalem. There was no temple site. There was no Hebron. We didn't capture the West Bank. Israel was incomplete. 3 weeks, he said this, 3 weeks before the Six-Day War, when the day after the Six-Day War, Rabbi Kook was seen as a prophet, as a hero. In fact, on that very day, a jeep came to pick him up with Rabbi Goren, who was then the chief rabbi of the armed forces, to drive him to the wall, so that Rabbi Kook would be able to sanctify the wall with his presence and recognize, and the shofar was blown at the wall. This was the shofar of redemption. This was the beginning of the announcement that the Messiah, and we are at the verge of a messianic age, a transformation, a type of otherworldly transformation. There was ecstasy in the air. And Rabbi Kook wrote the following: when Israel are in a situation of a collective and a state, God's glory appears in the world, encompassing everything. On the other hand, when there is no collective, no kingdom of Israel, that is the most terrible chilul Hashem. And no one has ever said this before, meaning this: when Jews live without a state, that's a desecration of God's name. Why? Because all other peoples have a state. How could it be that we, who are devoted to the creator of the world, we don't have a state? This must indicate some incapacity, some taint on our God, as in antiquity. You all know this, that when an empire was defeated, the conclusion was their God was defeated, and the people of the defeated God had to accept the God of the conquerors, and their temple was destroyed. We were the only people in antiquity who, when our temple was destroyed, we didn't give up on our God and we didn't give up on our sense of peoplehood. But Rabbi Kook says that it was an embarrassment. It was shameful that we lived as a historical people claiming to be a people. What kind of people were we? We didn't have a nation. We didn't have a state. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to our God. He must be a weak God. He must have abandoned us. Who said this, by the way? Who said this, that the destruction is a sign of God's abandonment? Christianity said that. Therefore, Christianity has come to replace Judaism. So to me, it's striking that Rabbi Kook, the Jr., uses this language. Then he says, look where he's going. The state needs an army, and therefore the army is sacred. Really? Divine might also reveals itself in the army. And thank God we also have a magnificent army whose reputation is known and famed throughout the world. In another place, he writes, the guns are sacred, the uniforms are sacred, right? The tanks, they're God's tanks, right? Everything that the Rav, meaning his father, predicted 1, 2, or more generations ago is coming true. The land of Israel in its full extent producing its fruit is in Jewish hands. All of Jerusalem is being built, the immigration of the Jews of Russia, the might of the IDF. Then he quotes the famous midrash that we've seen, sword and book came down intertwined from heaven for a sublime blessing and for eternal glory. For the people of the sword cannot be cut off from and free of the book, which is the might of our life and the length of our life, while the people of the book cannot be cut off and exempt from the sword, it being a required part of the people's source or life and sanctity. So Rabbi Kook reads, the midrash says, the sword and the book came down intertwined. So there's a question. What's the nature of the relationship between the sword and the book? We're going to see this same midrash used by many different commentators. But in Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda's hands, the midrash means the following. There must be a balance between sword and book. Book alone is not enough. Sword alone is not enough. They need both. And in this new situation where we've lived for 2,000 years only with a book. It's time for us to reclaim the sword. And we need to be able to utilize the sword to its fullest capacity, because in its being intertwined with the book, the utilization of the sword itself is in the service of the divine. The utilization of the sword in fighting, in battle, is itself a religious activity. That's what it's an empowerment. It's a religious empowerment of violence. So violence becomes in service of the divine. It's not just something that's necessary. It's something that's a value. That's the point I want to make. To Rabbi Kook, the sword and the book are values, and they have to be balanced. And the sword has value in Judaism. That's the distinctive nature of the Cookian approach. Messianic, the Father frames a type of coming messianic age. The Son moves beyond the idea of the messianic age to actively pursuing the realization of the messianic dream. And he sees the means that are being utilized to pursue the messianic dream as being sacred and holy. So this is the legacy that we confront if we want to deal with religion in the state of Israel today. Not only religion, if you want to deal with politics in the state of Israel today, know this, because the settlers, that's what they learned. The settlers are informed by these teachings. This is what rules, I'm sorry to say it this way, and with this voice. I know my tone is an angry tone. This is the stuff that controls the state of Israel today. This is what the world is seeing. The world is seeing the sword, and the sword of Israel as the value that we've embraced for our future and as our identity in terms of what Zionism has, how Zionism has been represented. But this is not the only voice. Now, one of the central issues with this voice of Rabbi Kook is the theology that develops around it and the moral principles, the moral philosophy that's linked to this idea that the sword is holy. And here you have it articulated by Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, one of the students of Rabbi Kook, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who writes the following: just as a divine commandment to conquer the land overrules the principle that he may live by them, that means, if I want to translate it, because he's not saying it, just as I know that the territory takes precedence over human life, that's what he's saying. Territory takes precedence over human life because it's a divine commandment. So, right, you have to fight for the land. So also does it transcend the human notions of national rights to the land. Meaning, don't tell me about the rights of Palestinians. This follows from the fundamental Jewish idea that human ethics and the universal sense of justice found in man derive their reality solely from the Word of God. Such is the message transmitted in the world in the account of the binding of Isaac, wherein the categorical superiority of the divine over human morality is dramatically exposed. What Rabbi Aviner is saying is that the divine command is ethical by definition because the divine commanded it. So if the divine commanded us to conquer the land, that's an ethical principle that we cannot challenge because it's God's command. Humans, their human values, those are challengeable. Those are things we argue about and we discuss, but divine ethics takes priority over human ethics. We live in a world when we live in a messianic reality. We live in a reality where we don't have to consider human motivations because we have God's word, which assures us of the truth, of the absolute truth. Man is, no doubt, instructed to act justly and righteously, but this too has no other meaning but that grounded in the will of the Creator. Don't worry, you need to be just, of course, but when you do what God says, no matter what you do, that's just. Thus, this is not an autonomous scale of values, the product of human reason, but rather heteronymous, or more correctly, theonomous, right? It's outside of us. It's a theological system outside of human consideration. A theonomous scale rooted in the will of the divine architect of the universe and its moral order. It's impossible to deny the word of God repeatedly inscribed in the Torah. roaring at us. You know, the Rashi, quoted Rashi that we saw. For unto you have I given this land in its entirety, that you should conquer it and settle therein. No amount of sophistry will succeed in distorting this cardinal element of the divine scheme. It is part of the ideal order of the universe. In other words, if God commanded it, it's built into the idea, you know, theologically, it's by definition part of the universe. You can't resist this idea. It's the way you must be, approved by God in the best interest of humanity. In other words, humanity, don't worry about all the killing that we're engaged with. It's God's will. Don't worry about the fact that we dominate the land without any compromise with the others. This is the way it's supposed to be. This has been built into the creation itself, regard for which is ingrained in the Jew. Indeed, the world is fortunate to have Israel in its midst. We're bringing blessing when we conquer the land, when we establish the sovereignty in the land, when we work towards messianic achievement. What we're doing is, and we are redeeming the world itself. This is a universal quest. We're not only working for our own self-interest. I mean, this is so contrary to the reality. To witness the Jewish people's restoration to a healthy existence through the length and breadth of the homeland. Such is the judgment of heaven, against which an inferior, earthbound, and rootless morality is threatened to strangle the spirit of the Messiah. The result of this type of messianic exaggeration is the following. I'm sorry to say. This is Rabbi Hess. Rabbi Hess was the campus rabbi at Bar Ilan, and when he wrote, this was I think after he wrote this column, he lost his position. Thank God. He wrote the following: "The day will soon come when we will all be called to fulfill the mitzvah of this jihad, to annihilate Amalek." That is the mitzvah of genocide. He wrote this in 1980, right? 1980. So who was Amalek? Amalek were the Palestinians. And the mitzvah is to eradicate them all. The manner of its implementation is detailed in 1 Samuel 15. Now go attack Amalek and prescribe all that belongs to them. Spare no one, but kill alike men, women, infants, and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and asses. So it's genocide. This is the mitzvah of genocide, according to Rabbi Hess. This is a direct consequence of empowering the religious spirit in the way in which you tell people that they're fulfilling God's will, and the messianic coming will result from our conquest. Conquest battle is not simply a necessity because we're being attacked, the Israel Defense Forces. No, conquest is a formal act of positive, constructive act of fulfillment that we're obligated to pursue. And conquest has itself religious significance. Now that's the position I feel that we have to counter. The counter to this sort of messianic push, I have to tell you, I'm exhausted just presenting it. Very difficult, because it seems to me that even secular Israelis, secular Jews are caught up in this sense of the messianism of what the state of Israel means. We've been misled. We've made an identification of a secular national enterprise with a religious vision, and we haven't been able to maintain the distinction between the two of them. In my argument for introducing religion into this conversation, I want to introduce religious values. I don't want to introduce religious coercion as a mode in the religious life of the state. I want to draw on the dimensions of Jewish religion that can humanize, that represent the humanistic tradition. And I want to end by quoting. There are two quotes that I want to share. You should see Gershom Scholem's. Gershom Scholem, who was the dean of scholars on Jewish messianism, who wrote about the danger, or spoke about the danger of the Gush Emunim, of the settlers, as being sort of Shabtai Tzvi. I don't have time to talk about that, but I'm sure in your CSP classes you've heard about Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiah in the 17th century, and the catastrophic consequence of his declaration of messianism. And we don't only need Shabtai Tzvi. Every push forward of a messianic ideology has never ended well for us. So two quotes, one by Rabbi Yehuda Amital and one by David Hartman, to conclude our day today. Amital, the head of the yeshiva in Gush Etzion, himself a survivor, a student of Rabbi Kook, a student of Rabbi Kook, writes the following: Gentlemen, it may be that all those who spoke about the beginning of the flowering of our redemption were mistaken. Whoa, whoa. I thought that it says so in the prayer for the state of Israel. The state of Israel is the beginning of our redemption. It is possible that the students of the Vilna Gaon, who talked about making Aliyah in the late 19th century or in the mid 19th century as a way of bringing the Messiah, were mistaken. They thought the Messiah would come in 1840. It may be that the students of the Baal Shem Tov, who also made Aliyah, the Hasidic Aliyah, thinking they were going to bring the Messiah, were mistaken. Perhaps the students of Rabbi Akiva Eger were mistaken. It's an important German, Polish rabbi when they spoke about the beginning of the flowering of our redemption as described in their books. It may be that Rabbi Kook was mistaken, and it may be that Rabbi Chalap was mistaken, Rabbi Kook's student. Rabbi Akiva, the greatest of the Tanaim, was also mistaken. This is an amazing thing. In other words, who was Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva was the rabbi who recognized Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century, the most catastrophic experience in Jewish history before the Holocaust, when tens of thousands of Jews were killed by the Romans because of this recognition of Bar Kokhba as the Messiah in the 130s. And so Rabbi Amital says something vital. Just because a doctrine or an idea was articulated by a great rabbi does not mean that we have to grant it credence. We have to assess it and see what it means and what its consequences are. And I now understand, he says, even though I was a student of Rabbi Kook, I see it's possible that these great rabbis made a mistake. Rabbis are only human beings, and they made a mistake regarding the identification of the contemporary state of Israel with the Messiah. That's not what it's really all about. It's about a revival of the Jewish people, not about the coming of the Messiah. It's about a revival of our sovereignty, not about the Messiah. It's about our entering history, not about the Messiah. And according to David Hartman, who wants to give it a religious tinge without its messianism, Hartman says the following: religious Zionism does not need to treat the rise of Israel as a divine ruse. It's not a trick on the way toward realizing the Messianic kingdom. Meaning, according to the Cookians, we got a state in order for the state to be able to be the means by which we get to the Messiah. Well, we need that. We need the state. There is an alternative perspective from which one can religiously embrace the secularized invitation to return to the land, namely the observation that Israel expands the possible range of halakhic involvement in human affairs beyond the circumscribed borders of home and synagogue to the public domain. The exercise of power moderated by moral sensitivities, attitude towards minorities and the stranger, tolerance and freedom of conscience. All these are realms that engage our sense of covenantal responsibility. So Hartman says, we don't need Messiah to give meaning, religious meaning to the state of Israel. The state of Israel has no, I have to say this again, no messianic significance. It's a vehicle, it's an instrument. The state itself is only an opportunity. It's a laboratory for the test of Judaism, what Soloveitchik said in that first quote that I read to you last week. How do we do as Jews once we have the power? Do we exercise Jewish values? How do we run social services in the country? How do we run the military in the country? How do we achieve justice and equality in the country? That's the test. That's the way in which we see whether Judaism really works or whether it's all been false, bloated words that were impressed upon us by our educators, but when push came to shove, we couldn't live up to it. So Hartman says the state of Israel is the major test. Judaism is no longer pots and pans. It's not the kitchen. It's not prayer any longer. I mean, it is. It includes that, but that's not what it only is. It's beyond that. It has social significance. How does Judaism speak to the world? Then the state of Israel could become a model by which other nations might be able, from which other nations can draw some significant values and a significant understanding of how to function in a humanistic way. That's what Hartman wanted to pursue. I'll stop with that and take some questions, even though it's very late. Please, Cheryl.
Thank you. Can I just ask you to stop share so people can see you full screen? We'll go into a few questions and maybe just a few minutes over the time so that we get some in. And I'll go by order and start with Echad Ha'am. There were a couple of questions about him saying about being careful, and is it not naive to constantly be so fearful of exerting power when we hold power?
Aha. The good question. And I look, I don't know what Echad Ha'am would say today, but I would say, but at least this, because I don't know in general, because there's a reality. I mean, he understood this, that once there's a state, there's an army, and you have to exercise power. But the question becomes how exercising power responsibly. And exercising power responsibly doesn't always mean showing everybody that you have power. Seems to me that the weak person is the one who always needs to punch back. The strong person doesn't always have to punch back. The strong, in fact, I'll give you a direct answer. The Abravanel, you know who Abravanel, I mean, I'm looking at all of you. You must have heard the name Don Isaac Abravanel. He was the Minister of Finance in Ferdinand Isabella's government. He was the Minister of Finance, I think, for the Portuguese king for one as well. Came from a very obviously well-established affluent family, and he was a learned scholar. He was a leader of the Spanish Jewish community before the expulsion. He may have been the last, he was the last Jew to see Ferdinand and Isabella before the order before the decree was issued, with Torquemada in the room, and decreeing that the Jews have to be expelled. He made the last-minute appeal. So he knew something about government, and he knew something about ruling, and he knew something about power. So on the verse in the Torah that says that as you approach a city to make war with it, you must send out, you have to send out a peace mission before waging war. So Abravanel quotes Cicero and says, we know that the queen bee is the only bee that doesn't have a stinger. Get it? It's only the worker bees that have stingers, that have to show that they can defend themselves. But the queen, by virtue of their presence, doesn't need a stinger. That's real power. Real power is not necessarily killing the other party. That's what Echad Ha'am would embrace. That's the lesson that he would transmit. You don't always need to use power to show that you are powerful. That type of restraint. And the mature nation, he would say, understands through its history, through a confrontation with its teachings, how to negotiate when power is necessary, when the exertion of power in a violent way is necessary, and when not necessary. But the ideal would be to restrain that violence as much as possible so that it doesn't become a regular mode that you depend on and that you utilize for simple political purposes. That's the problem. Violence should not be used for political purposes. It's not an option. It can be necessary. That's the profound lesson that we were supposed to carry with us.
I'm gonna skip to
people did say he was naive. I mean, the question is a good question. That was part of the response. He's sitting and reading and smoking his cigar. That's very nice, but he's not dealing with the reality. And he had a major break. He had a break with the political Zionists on this ground. He said, "What do you think you're doing? You want to build a state. On what basis are we going to build a state? What are the principles on which that state will be founded? Have you worked it through? Before you build the state, you have to rebuild the Jews so that the Jews have a framework on which to base their state. That framework is somehow re-looking at their tradition and re-encountering the Judaism, because the Judaism that they're bringing with them is the Judaism of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Now we're in the 19th and 20th century where we need a political outlook. We don't have a Jewish framework, a political framework that's been worked out that we can now bring to bear on the creation of a modern nation state in the 20th century, says Echad Ha'am. Before we go to declaring a state, let's do the work, the inner work, of building an understanding of what that's going to look, what the principles of a state, of a Jewish state, what the values of the Jewish state are going to look like. That was his argument with Herzl. Herzl said we have to go towards a state because survival is a central issue, and Ahad Ha'am says we have to go towards rebuilding Judaism because the future of meaning is the issue.
Okay, I'm gonna move us through a couple more questions. One was about the concept of history that Rav Kook mentioned, and the fact that he ties it only, or does he tie it only to the political arena, or the way he ties those two together?
So Rabbi Kook, one could say, I mean, again, I have to be honest with you. You know, I myself, I'm not a historian and I'm not a philosopher, but I can say this, that Rabbi Kook was a Hegelian, and he had a sense of the term, a traditional sense of the flow of history, and that history in some ways was determined. It was actually going to end up in a particular way, and it was going to end up. In other words, we had our rise in history and established ourselves. Then, for most of history, we were in decline, and then comes the Messianic age, in which we re-achieve our historical presence, and we bring to bear all you know, the lessons, the religious lessons that we've learned, and to bring about a Messianic age. So Rabbi Kook felt that this was determined, that the First World War was a sign of some apocalyptic event that we were about to witness. This was the dawn of a new age. In the same way, if you think about, you know, Reform Judaism saw in the 19th century with emancipation a type of universal age in which they develop Reform Jews a mission theory, that it's our task to bring about the Jewish teachings to the world at large. Rabbi Kook felt that the First World War was the beginning of a process by which the Messiah would be revealed, and that history would flow naturally. This is a very different notion of history than we have, where we believe in human agency and that humans determine history. Rabbi Kook operated in a sphere where God determined history. God decided that the Jews should be exiled and live absent from history until God decided that we should come back. And Rabbi Kook felt that the beginning of the 20th century there was a signal. It's time for us to come back. God has given us the signal. That was the war that unleashed this sense of optimism and zeal in his thinking.
Thank you.
So it's not what we would call normal history. Let me say something else. You know, in the late 80s, there was an underground, the Jewish underground. They tried to blow up the Temple Mount. So they were infiltrated, they were caught, then they were arrested, and they asked them, they said, don't you know, what were you trying to do? The day after you blew up the Temple Mount, there would be a world war. All the Arab nations all over the world would be standing up to fight against the state of Israel. It would be a catastrophe, a worldwide catastrophe. And you know what they said. The planners of the underground. They said that will be the time for God to show His stuff. Meaning they no longer, because they lived in a messianic realm, because they lived in a godly domain, they lost all sense of cause and effect. Because there's no cause and effect in God's domain. God will do whatever God can do. In the human domain, in the historical domain, there's cause and effect, and you can assess the consequence of your actions. They said, we don't have to assess the consequence of our actions because God is in control. That's the Cookian version of history and of theology, unfortunately. And it's a version that is, I think, really what's the word I'm looking for? It's not only lacking, it's something that leads us astray. It leads us astray. Yes. Final question.
Yes, well, there are many, but I'll choose one that I think many people have asked in different versions. How do you use power responsibly or restrain power or choose how to use power when you're up against enemies that do want to destroy.
Annihilate you. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, you know, I say you have to be smart, and you have to be wise. Look, I'll tell you again my own personal feelings, and many of you will disagree with me. After the October 7th attack, so I thought for a long time, because you know they were Israel didn't respond right away, and there was a question: how will Israel respond? And part of me said, a great part of me said, we've been here before. We've responded before. And every time we've come back to the same place. Why will this time be different from any other time? That to me seemed to be a basic question. No, I didn't articulate that question because you weren't allowed to ask such a question. It sounded like you were against Israel responding, and Israel had a right to respond. But some of you know also that at that moment, there was a great deal of sympathy for Israel in the world. I don't know. Can we trust the others? Again, I don't know. I just wonder, was there an alternative? Do we ever consider the possibility of alternative? Or the only response is our right to defend ourselves with more violence? Does violence ever resolve the issue? I mean, you know, what have we learned from history? And of course, nations have the greatest difficulty in swallowing their pride. What would we look like to the world, right? They only understand power. That's the only thing, right? And so if we operate in that way, we'll always fight, and you'll always tell me, you know, what's the alternative? So we're going to get to a text later on, and I'll end with this because it's late, by Rabbi Amiel. He concludes, by the way, that the book has to overwhelm the sword. For him, it's not a question of balance. That Judaism is about the defeat of the sword by the book. So he says, "What are you're going to tell me? How can the book defeat the sword? Be serious. Come on." And he says, and he's absolutely correct. He says, the power of the sword is ephemeral. I'll add, every empire has ceased to be an empire. Every empire has sunset in human history because of the hubris of power that eventually led to the self-destruction of the empire. Look at the Romans. You can look at Israel in antiquity. You could look at the French Empire. I mean, at every stage, eventually led to self-destruction. The book remains. The words are eternal. The teachings are what give strength to humanity. And the teachings are the foundation of human existence and human survival, not the sword. So there is a battle, and it's an internal battle to see what do we hold firm, what do we hold firmly that allows us true survival. I'm not against survival, right? And so this is a question, at least with which we have to be engaged. And it can't be resolved so simply in saying the only answer they know is bang, because even that doesn't seem to be the answer. We need something more complex. To be continued next week. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Chaim, thank you very much. I know, I mean, you fully bring your opinions and worldview, and that's appreciated. I know for many people on the call, it's not the way they think, and I thank everyone for holding the space and listening and asking difficult questions. I think, to me, that's beautiful to be able to grapple with these issues with people that disagree and think differently, and also to hear you bring your opinions forward fully.
Sure. What I'd like to suggest, we need more time. We need an entire session just to have this discussion. and let everybody speak and be face to face. I think that's critical. Maybe we can figure out some day or night or weekend or whatever in the future where we can do this. I would love to do it because I think it's something that as a community we need to argue out with one another and respectfully and understand the different positions. And I have to tell you that I know that the only alternative is not the Messianists, right? There is an argument to be made that's not messianic, right? The reason that I focus on the Messianists is because they've hijacked Judaism and they've hijacked the state of Israel and they control the politics. And we better know that, and we don't. We don't know that. We think there's normal politics over there. There are no normal politics going on over there, in the same way that there are no normal politics going on in our country. This is not a good time politically. So we need to be able to have a conversation among people who see one another's position and understand we may not all be, I may not have all the wisdom. I may not have the right answer. I know that. I know that. But it's an opinion that I think should enter into the discussion. Thank you for your patience and your tolerance and your inclusiveness.